This is Special Chronicles, giving respect and a voice to people with special needs.
I shudder thinking how the world can be so cruel. Lend my voice to those who can't. It's time we try, it's time we care, it's time we stand. It starts with a voice.
Welcome to the Special Chronicles Podcast. My name is Daniel Smokowski. I'm the founder and host of Special Chronicles and a Southern Tribal Global Messenger alum with Special Olympics. Our website, specialchronicles.com, for the show notes and to follow Special Chronicles on social media, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the Special Chronicles Podcast, we rebroadcast an excerpt of our conversation with Jorge Hernandez-Perez, the 2021 Southeast Youth of the Year with the Boys and Girls Club of America and a student at Columbia University, class of 2025. Jorge talks about how his identities of immigrating from Cuba, diagnosed with ADHD, and identifying as gay have shaped him as a human in society. The following episode has been previously broadcasted.
This is Special Chronicles, giving respect and a voice to people with special needs.
I shudder thinking how the world can be so cruel. Lend my voice to those who can. It's time we try, it's time we care, it's time we stand. It starts with a voice.
Welcome to the Special Chronicles show. My name is Daniel Smokowski. I'm the founder of Special Chronicles and the Special Olympics Southern Tribal International Global Messenger. Our website, specialchronicles.com, where you can stream our archives of over 750 episodes absolutely for free. And to follow Special Chronicles on social media, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you listen to your podcast. This week on the Special Chronicles show, Augustus Jorge Hernandez-Perez, the 2021 Southeast Youth of the Year with the Boys and Girls Club of America and a student at Columbia University. Jorge is here to talk about his story from Cuba to Columbia University, which includes sharing the stage with First Lady of the United States of America, Dr. Joe Biden. So please put your virtual hands together as we welcome Jorge on the Special Chronicles show, specialchronicles.com. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's good to have you on. And I guess as before we get into your story, maybe we could kind of briefly kind of have you share with the listeners how we got connected, because I think it was last October, I believe, 2022, we were on stage together in Atlanta at the Coca-Cola headquarters. So I don't know if you kind of want to recount how to kind of share with our listeners how we got connected.
So first of all, thank you for clarifying that it's Columbia University. Every single time I tell someone, or every single time someone asks me where I'm going to college and I say Columbia, they always think the country. Fine. So you're right. We did get together and we did organize the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit. I had gotten an invitation to the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit about 2 weeks prior to the actual summit because another Boys and Girls Club youth had pulled out. And so I was a little worried about who was going to be on my panel. And I think we met virtually about a week before the summit. And you were telling your story and you were telling your experiences. And it was absolutely so thrilling and heartwarming to hear. We then got to the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit, and we were on a youth panel together. It was me, you, and I think 3 other youth.
Yes.
Every single time you would say something, and every single time you would bring up your experiences and how you lived authentically via your experiences, it was something that everyone in the audience, and you can tell, everyone in the audience looked up to. So I wanted to thank you for sharing that at the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit. Afterwards, the summit talked a lot about social identity, and they talked a lot about what it means to be a youth in America today, what it means to be part of this generation that is hoping for significant systemic change in our country. And so you touched a lot about what it means to have a disability and what it means to be an individual with a disability. I talked about equitable education, and there was so much overlap in that because education, the education system, not only targets students of color and low-income students, but also students with disabilities. And so we were able to have a lot of dialogue backstage afterwards, and it was just fantastic meeting you, and now we're here.
Yeah, awesome. I know.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was awesome meeting you, and the same thing that week before, meeting virtually, and then talking backstage and talking on stage, and hearing your story of really, which I think is kind of the foundation of bringing you on this podcast, is all three of your identities and your formative years shaped you as a human. And I think what hopefully all listeners will gain from this conversation today is that every human, and using your story as an example this week, every human has different identities that form them from their younger years throughout their education, to whether it's their heritage, whether it's disability, whether it's just any identity that each human and that's what I think really also kind of tying that back to the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit. All of us, and I'm probably on the little older side of the youth, but without aging myself too much. But what I just said of kind of how this episode is kind of focused on, all of our stories, like you said, overlapped, and all of our stories kind of have that theme of each of our different identities, whether it's your story, my story, Mackenzie's story. Each of our stories kind of shaped each of us as a human, and that's the impact that our younger generation, that I think so much of the audience there really took away from the summit, is that each of our stories, that's the impact that will grow the future. If we just take time to listen to our stories. And I think that's what's so powerful about podcasts. And this podcast, for example, is that we're taking the time, and yes, we're doing video too, but particularly audio. But if people take the time, whether it's on a podcast, whether we're on stage speaking on a panel at a summit in Atlanta or wherever, when people take time to listen to our stories, then that's the impact that I think that we can have in the future.
Yeah, I also think that our generation particularly is so informed and so aware of how their particular identities can not only shape their experiences, but shape their viewpoint throughout life. And I'm going to talk about this later on in the interview. But it's basically going to be this thing of how do we live authentically, and how do we make sure that our environment and the external conditions that we grow up on don't fully shape who we are, but how do we also give in a little and understand that who we are is shaped by our environment and by our identities interacting with those around us. So I think our generation is fully aware of that. And so I do have a lot of hope for future leaders of our generation.
Awesome. Yeah, me too. So I love that you touched on that. And now as we kind of move into your story. So, can you tell us a little bit about your early years? Because I found it really empowering to when in getting to know you about what was it 9 months ago when we were together in Atlanta. Hearing your story, can you kind of share with our listeners your childhood growing up in Cuba and you and your family coming to America?
Yeah, so I was born in Santa Clara, Cuba, and I had my entire family there. And then I came to the United States when I was 7.5. I came to Sarasota, Florida, and started attending public school there. And I lived with my mother and with my grandmother at that time. And so in Cuba, I had my father, who was a very formative figure for me, and I had my aunt, who was also a very formative figure for me. I like to say that throughout my life, I have been raised by incredibly independent and powerful women, and that's really shaped my perspective on how I'm supposed to approach the world and with what vigor I approach the world. My aunt, every single time we would have a conversation, she would always repeat a very, very similar statement again and again. I never want you to alter a particular part of who you are in order to make other people happy or in order to make other people more proud of you. I think that there was an understanding during my childhood that I was gay, particularly from my aunt. And of course, this LGBTQ plus identity was not fully accepted in Cuba. And so there was a lot of stigma that came with it. And my aunt was one of the few people who not only understood this, but didn't shove it aside and didn't completely ignore it. She came up to me and she reminded me every day to not conceal parts of myself in order to seek acceptance. And so those communications with my aunt were very formative, particularly for a young gay man who was just coming to terms with a sexual identity. I then came to the United States. And then I had to leave my aunt back, which was really heartbreaking because this woman had raised me from when I was born. And so I came to the United States with my mother and with my grandmother, and I was enrolled in the public education system of Sarasota, Florida. I went to Wilkinson Elementary, which is the most underfunded and under-resourced school in Sarasota, Florida. And my mother was working 3 full-time jobs at the time, I like to say. She was a nurse, or she was studying to be a nurse. She was in nursing school. She was working at the airport full-time, and she was a mother full-time to my little sister and I. And so, again, these experiences with my mother working extremely hard to give me the future that she didn't have, with me attending a public education system that I knew there was something wrong with, I just couldn't put my hand on it, was leaving my family behind, the immigrant story of adapting and altering who you are to fit into a new country. All these experiences can really shape an individual. And it all started back in Cuba with my Cuban heritage and with the immigrant experience, which I think can be a collective experience for a lot of immigrants in America, learning a new language, coming to a country that you have no idea about, making new friends. And so that's just a little.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing your story, and we'll get into a little bit more of your formative years, and in particular, how your identities have shaped you as an individual, have shaped you as a human in society. And then how an organization such as the Boys and Girls Club of America have helped you to get to where you are today. Because when we have organizations, whether it's like for yourself, the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, whether it's a Special Olympics, like for myself, when we have these organizations that support us and with these resources, that's another impact that kind of helped to shape us as an individual, as a human. So we'll get into much more of your story in this episode after we take a short break. Our guest is Jorge from a student at Columbia University that we want to continue to emphasize, and hopefully, if I remember to update the graphic for this episode, we will make sure. But if we don't, then listeners, all the thousands of you listeners will know just by listening to the beginning of this episode. So hopefully, yes. We'll be right back right here on SpecialChronicles.com. Support for Special Chronicles comes from listeners like you. As an independent public media podcast, Special Chronicles will always be there for you. Now we're asking you to be there for us. As a nonprofit independent media organization, we can only make programs like Special Chronicles with listener support. Our programs provide weekly, candid, honest, and inspiring conversations about the people with disabilities community that creates awareness, support, and advocacy within each week's episode. Listeners tell us our shows are an enjoyable and necessary podcast for the intellectual and developmental disability community and everyone else who is able to listen to stories about life from a different angle. Please, if you and your family love our weekly podcasts, make a one-time, monthly, or annual gift of thanks today. Support this podcast at specialchronicles.com/give. That's specialchronicles.com/give. Our guest is Jorge, a student at Columbia University. And so now that our listeners kind of have had that background of sorry, my dad was peeping his head into the studio. and see, here's the thing. We just came back 30 seconds ago from that break, right? Yeah. If only he would have if he would have popped his head into the studio a minute ago. But then again, as you and our viewers can tell, I'm wearing headphones, and so he doesn't know what.
Is he still there?
No, he's just leaving right now.
To meet him.
Yeah. So next time. Anyways, so because I think you met him when we were in Atlanta. Okay. So because he was there. I think he was at one of the tables right in front of the stage that we were on. Anyways, so now that our listeners have kind of had a introduction to your early years, can you kind of tell us a little bit about how your formative years and your identity, how and kind of give us kind of a brief a brief glimpse of your identities, your Cuba heritage identity, your ADHD diagnosis in high school, and then your gay identity. Kind of in, because I think in our pre-show, which I think our pre-show was a couple months ago, but we you had kind of talked about that your identities were in that order, and in the first segment you talked about that Cuba. So now kind of if we were able to kind of take our listeners on kind of through your story, so that you talked about your Cuba heritage, and now kind of if we kind of continue in with your story, can you kind of talk about those other two identities? And
so I mentioned that I came from Cuba and that I attended the public education system in Sarasota, Florida. And I think the first experience that really woke me up, or that really gave me some insight into how exactly an immigrant would traverse the United States of America, was the public education system. I was a Spanish speaker first and foremost. I did not know any English, so I had to go into the ESOL classrooms. And in those classrooms, I realized that my ESOL instructor didn't really have the time to fully educate me in English. I also realized that my ESOL instructor was focused on so many other students and didn't really have the proper training to focus on English instruction. I knew there was something wrong with this, and so I started learning English by myself. I would come home every night, and my mother would pull out a ginormous English to Spanish dictionary, and she would put Jane Eyre in front of me. And I would flip through literally every page, learning every single word and trying to understand the meaning of the text. So that's really how I learned English, and I was starting to grapple with what it means to be an immigrant in the United States, particularly a low-income immigrant who goes to a school that can't really support his endeavors. When I was in middle school, I was eating lunch, and my grandmother, who I lived with, had made me some plantains, some rice, some beans, and some chicken. This is the meal that I ate literally every night for dinner, and my grandmother thought, why not make it lunch? So I brought it to school in a container. I opened it up, and then a person sitting next to me looks at the food and said, that looks disgusting. It is those particular moments. I want you to picture this moment in which I have ate this my entire life. My family has served this their entire life from generation to generation. It is literally part of my Cuban heritage, and someone disregards it like that. And so I do want you to picture that moment, because I think part of being an immigrant is the stigmatization that comes about your cultural heritage and your cultural context. In high school, I was also diagnosed with ADHD, and I think that a lot of times that really brought me to the disability, and specifically the disability justice movement. I started looking into how the ADA was passed, into how individuals with disabilities were treated throughout American history, and into how their rights were tolerated and even expanded in the early 1990s. I think with ADHD, it is a very specific form of an invisible disability. And so the experiences are often not known by the people not feeling it. And so, for example, ADHD, yes, it's a distraction from certain tasks and from certain schoolwork, but as you mature, that capacity to be distracted goes away, and it starts formalizing into more significant social barriers that you have to cross. I think for me, the most significant one is the 9-to-5 job. I cannot sit still for like 8 hours of my day focusing on a particular task. I'm going to need movement and I'm going to need emotion. That's just an example. And then you mentioned how in high school, I also started to come to terms with what being gay means, and exactly specifically what being a gay Cuban immigrant means in a very conservative and Christian nationalist state of Florida. A lot of times I would have conversations that were either homophobic microaggressions or just detriments to me coming out and fully expressing who I was. All of these identities from elementary school to high school shaped who I was. But the most important point that I want to emphasize, Daniel, is that when we are growing up and when we are young, we have this capacity and this tendency to think about the impossible and the possible. What I mean by that is when I came to the United States, I was told about the American dream. The American dream is anyone who comes to this country can work hard, can throw themselves at their work, and they will succeed and they will accomplish. And everything seemed to be possible. As I traverse my life, specifically through the education system, through the experiences that I've had with fellow students, with educators that didn't have the training, with schools that didn't have the funding, I started to realize that a lot of the American dream was actually impossible. That the American dream oftentimes presents itself as something that everyone can achieve, but only a select few with the economic resources, with the class background, with the racial and ethnic background can actually achieve it. And so as I got older, I realized that certain things were not going to be possible unless I made them possible. I think that the job of public service and the job of government is to turn the impossible into the possible. And that's something that I'm really trying to dedicate my life to. And that's something that I'm really trying to focus my attention on, specifically with my experiences.
Awesome. I loved what you said about toning the impossible into the possible, and really hopefully in educators, in both educators and government leaders can kind of heal that what you just said, that people think of the American dream as one thing, but when, like, what you and your story, what you discovered was that's not true. And so how, and I think by hearing your story and hearing those stories of how we can make the impossible possible, do you think that's how we can make change happen? Like, I'm going to kind of touch on that, that we maybe we may touch on this at the end of the episode, but it kind of fits into what we'll talk about now. So, like, do you think that it's possible to change the impossible to the possible in kind of healing all those stories?
Yeah, I think that stories are a good way to constitute this idea of dissent, of disagreeing with current institutions or with current systems. I think that every time we share an experience, I think that every time we share an identity, I think that every time we share a story, particularly in this podcast with so many viewers, we are expressing dissent and distaste with current institutions. I think that whoever is listening can not only empathize with stories, but stories have a particular capacity to allow other people to put themselves in their shoes. This is why some of the most significant social change that has happened throughout history has been because of movies, has been because of literature, has been because of podcasts like these. And so, if we're talking about the capacity of stories to really turn the impossible into the possible, that can serve a very big role in our society. The other thing I was going to say is that every protest and every dissent that we see throughout this nation is not only a disagreement with current institutions, but it's a new generation trying to form themselves and trying to be a part of American history and trying to form a generational identity in American history. And so every protest that we see, every story that we tell disagreeing with something also forms an identity and also makes an identity more public. And so I think you have those two things of holding institutions accountable, but also allowing you to express yourself. And I think that stories have such an important role in both of those aspects.
Awesome. I love that. And also kind of add in to that is when we hold these institutions accountable, then while also kind of taking our stories and like you said, forming an identity, people are able to really get to know us and understand our stories. And tying that back to our disability community, I think a lot of times, and this over past 15 years, over 700 episodes, people are, I think the first time when, and the same thing with any identity that we have, people focus on our challenges. People focus on that first identity of, I guess, almost like a negative viewpoint. And even some of the identities that kind of shape you, I think that first, and I think part of that probably has to do with a lot of the institutions focus on that negative, the negative side of our disability, the negative side of whatever identity that we identify with. Whereas when people get to hear our stories, when they're hearing your story on this podcast, when they hear my story or any of the stories of the guests that we have, or just anybody's story, we're able to kind of hopefully change that mindset. The guest, we're recording this in the middle of April, so this past week's guest was talked about inclusive mindsets and really how, for example, like this podcast is a perfect example of building and understanding inclusive mindsets. And I think we can kind of tie that into your story, that if we're able to kind of understand inclusive mindsets in our stories, then that's a way that we can hopefully change. So that hopefully in later years down the road, whether it's for the next generation or kind of in American history further down the road, we can hopefully maybe not even have those, well, the first thing that people see when they see our identities, they see our disability, that negative side is not even part of the conversation. Do you want to maybe kind of touch on that? Like, do you think that's possible? Or?
Yeah. So I'm going to take your example of disability and how disability has been perceived throughout American history. First, we started with the medical model of disability, and that started because there was a lot of scientists who were doing medical research on what it means to be neurodivergent, on what it means, on the experiences and the barriers that people with other forms of disability have. And a lot of times I feel that with disability specifically, that medical model led to a lot of stigmatization. And there was an understanding in the American public that individuals with disabilities could not do X, Y, and Z, or could not thrive socially and economically because of their disability. What I loved about the passage of the ADA and the 20 years that followed after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act is that we started to turn the medical model of disability into the social model of disability. We started to not only see disability in a positive context, but we also started to realize something else. The barriers that individuals with disabilities face, whether that's an invisible disability like neurodivergence, or whether that's a physical and very visible disability, the barriers that individuals with disabilities face are not because of the disability, but they are because of social barriers put in place. Disability is intrinsically not a negative thing, but it becomes a negative aspect of one's life because there are social institutions and social barriers that inhibit someone from doing a particular task. I talked about the 9-to-5 workplace and how that might not always work with people with ADHD. That's not because ADHD is intrinsically bad. It's because the 9-to-5 workplace is set up in a place that's not really conducive to everyone's identities. And so this idea of taking the negative out of disability and taking the negative out of identity, and instead understanding that one's social identity inhibits one's capacity for economic security, for social mobility, not because of the identity, but because of social structures is so important. We can apply this to anything else. Race is not an inhibitor. Racism is an inhibitor. Xenophobia is the inhibitor, not Latinos not being an inhibitor to economic security. And so I think that what you touched upon on how we paint in a negative light certain identities is so important.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. And of all there's going to be a lot that our listeners can learn from your story, but I think what you and I just touched on in this kind of around this 30-minute mark of this conversation, that is going to be so a powerful takeaway for our listeners to kind of come away from this episode, that not just listening to us talk for an hour, but really coming away to make, like, we don't just get on a podcast just to talk. We get on to share our stories to make change happen, to make social justice happen. Moving on, before we take our next break, can you kind of wrap up this kind of a segment of talking about your identities? Can you share with us how your identities and how has it shaped you as an individual and you as a human in society? How has all this, if you were to kind of sum that up into how your identities have shaped you as an individual in society.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to be quick because I know you have a sponsor break coming up.
Yes.
But whenever I think about this, there's always two conflicting points. One of living authentically, and that basically means of living with authenticity in your life. It means there should be no external impediments or boundaries to what you can and cannot do. And so your identity, who you are as an individual, should be purely decided by you within your individual sphere. There should be no influence externally. But then there's this thing of how social barriers form us. And those with different identities experience society in such a different way. And so we have this of authenticity, how we should be ourselves without anyone telling us who to be, and B, that's nearly impossible in an American society for those who maintain an identity that has systemic and structural inequities that come along with it. And so I've been trying to grapple with these two contradictory statements, how I can be myself, but also myself is always defined by an other, by someone else around me, or by an external power. As I think about this more, and as I'm coming to consciousness, I'm starting to realize that both of these can coexist in a very, very beautiful way. I think that I found the capacity to live authentically, even though I didn't attend the best public schools, or even though I woke up at 4 a.m. and my mother was studying and folding laundry at the same time. I think that one's capacity to live authentically is made harder by the social barriers that you face with your identity, whether it's ADHD, whether it's being gay, or whether it's having another social identity. But eventually, as you come to consciousness, the struggle of one's life is making sure that those social barriers don't define who you are and that you live authentically. And so I hope that sums it up, but it's really those two contradictory things that I have to come to terms with.
Awesome. Well, there's a lot more that we probably could cover, but for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and take our next break. When we come back, we'll transition a little bit to talking about the Boys and Girls Club of America, as well as then we'll take another break, and then after the break, we'll get into final thoughts, and we'll conclude with having you talk about lessons that you learned when you share the stage with Dr. Joe Biden. So we'll leave our listeners, hopefully all of you listening will keep listening to the end of this episode to hear the lessons that our First Lady taught you, Jorge. And so we'll be right back right here on SpecialChronicles.com.
Support for Special Chronicles comes from listeners like you. We invite you to access Special Chronicles Plus, our behind-the-scenes podcast, bonus content, and to help support the show. Visit specialchronicles.com/plus. That's specialchronicles.com/plus to join today. And support for Special Chronicles comes from ComEd Energy Force Ambassador Program, the country's first energy and solar efficiency and education program designed for and taught by people with disabilities. Learn more at specialchronicles.com/ComEd. That's specialchronicles.com/ComEd. Finally, support for Special Chronicles comes from United Airlines Bridge Disability Business Resource Group, connecting people of all abilities. Learn more on United's commitment to disability inclusion for employment and travel at specialchronicles.com/United. That's specialchronicles.com/United. And as I fade that off, we hope that you have enjoyed this week's excerpt episode. You can listen to the full episode. The link will be in the show notes. The link to the full episode will be in the show notes. Just a few reminders at the end of the episode. You can shop our merchandise store and know that 60%, that's 60% of the profits will go to Special Chronicles. Our Special Chronicles merch store is managed by Outshine Labels. We have t-shirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, and candles. Visit specialchronicles.com/shop. That's specialchronicles.com/shop to shop our merchandise store today. And be sure to tap that follow button right now. Go ahead. I'll wait. Go ahead. Go tap that follow button on the Special Chronicles podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, so you never miss a new episode. The new episodes drop weekly. Don't miss out. Well, we're doing content that will help you make impactful, inclusive connections in your life through our podcast. And remember, our website, specialchronicles.com. That's specialchronicles.com, where you can see my archives of over 750 episodes absolutely for free. And follow Special Chronicles on social media, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back next week. Every week in June, we will have rebroadcasted episodes related to a particular theme that's happening that week. And stay tuned in July. We've got an exciting new mini series coming well, just keep following and stay subscribed to this podcast, because you do not want to miss what's coming up in this month and next month right here, exclusively on specialchronicles.com. And so until then, remember, choose to include, and disabled voices matter. I'll catch you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Special Chronicles Podcast. Our podcast was produced by Daniel Smukowski on the Special Chronicles Network. Follow Special Chronicles on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Subscribe, rate, and review Special Chronicles on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Our website, specialchronicles.com, where you can stream our archives of over 500 episodes for absolutely for free. Also, there's a list of our favorites, original series, award-winning columns, and blogs. And sign up for our newsletter to receive exclusive bonus content delivered to your inbox. Again, specialchronicles.com. Special Chronicles is hosted by Podbean Podcast Hosting. Our live streams are powered by StreamYard. Thanks, as always, to our business manager, Adam Smukowski, who always encourages us to never give up. I'm Daniel Smukowski, back next week with more stories.
Special Chronicles, giving respect and a voice to people with special needs.